Hey guys, John here. Welcome back to the course, How to Use Zebra HZ. This is video 2, and today we're talking about the global settings down in the bottom left here. So let's go to the display port, right click, and go to init. So we're all starting on a fresh preset. And down over here, the first thing that we're going to see is pitch -12. So by default, all these patches will come down 1 octave here. And you can change that by clicking this here and going to 0. Or alternatively, you can scroll with your mouse wheel, which is a really cool way to change settings on the fly in a very fast way. So back to init here. Below that, we have fine tuning, so -50 cents and +50 cents. And below that, we have our bend range. So bend minus, we have a range from 0, if we don't want any bend range at all the way up to 48. But keep in mind, we have 1 all the way to 12, and then 12 all the way to 24. And then from here, it's just going to jump octaves, 24, 36, and then to 48. And the same thing goes for the bend positive as well. We have the exact same range over here. So moving on from there, glide is a very cool thing, Portamento, right? So it's basically the gliding of notes. So normally we would play notes like this, right? But if we use glide, it's going to glide, it's going to pitch bend to the different notes that we play. And the more this knob is increased, the more glide we get. And something to keep in mind, because there's 2 different modes here. We have time, which is basically saying it's a fixed amount of time, depending on where this knob is, that the notes will glide into each other. However, if we go from time to rate, basically the longer distance of your notes, so the more intervals between the notes that you play, the longer the glide will be. So for example, let's say we have a really low note, and then to a high note. It's going to take all this time to finally reach its destination, but if we have 2 high notes, it's not going to take that long. But now we go to a low note, it's going to take much longer. So that's basically the 2 different versions of glide. So let's go back to time, because I mostly use time for most of my patches here. And another cool setting here is called range. So by default, it's going to be all the way to the top here. So it's basically default Portamento. Going to turn this down just a little bit here of the glide. And the lower that we change this range, what's basically going to happen is that the bend is going to be closer to our target note than from like the beginning of our first note. So if that doesn't make sense, take a listen and kind of look at this graph here. So this is normal, right? All the notes are connected through this glide. So as we change this range here, we can see that the glide doesn't necessarily start at the first note that we hit, but it's closer to the note that we're targeting, so the next note that we play. And all the way to the left, it's basically if we didn't even have glide on. So it's a very cool setting right over here. Now glide 2, so this one can be a little bit confusing because we have a glide and then what's a glide 2. So in short, glide 2 is a bipolar offset of glide 1. So if we change this here, we're like, what the heck? This isn't doing anything. I don't understand this. So 2 things that we need to note. So with glide 2, this is going to work with the even numbered modules. So for example, oscillator 2, oscillator 4, the filter 2, filter 4, so on and so forth. And it's going to be an offset to that. So for example, let's open up oscillator number 2 and let's disable 1 for now, right? Let's put glide 2 back to normal. So we have regular functionality with a little bit of glide. Now, as soon as we change this knob here, we're starting to get an offset. So as we turn it to the right, it's getting longer. And if we turn it to the left, it's basically counteracting what we have already over here. So you might ask yourself, why is this useful? And it's kind of cool if you have 2 different oscillators going, right? Because oscillator 1 will only see glide and it won't see glide 2. But oscillator 2 will see both of these. So if we have these by default and have 2 oscillators going, they're both following the same glide, but as soon as we deviate a little bit here on glide 2, we can see that glide 2 is changing oscillator number 2 and is adjusting the offset of that glide just by a little bit, so we kind of have two different independent glides. So it's a very cool thing. And also keep in mind, before we move on from glide 2, is that this is also going to follow key follow 2, which is another modulator, which we're going to get to a little bit later in the course, but just kind of have that in your brain for now. Okay, so let's go back to a new preset here, and let's tackle this voice section over here. So we're all familiar with poly, right? So we can play a lot of notes at the same time. Right, so it kind of makes sense in that sense. So we can go from poly to re-trigger. So this is basically going to be mono. So we can only play one note at a time, right? And keep in mind, re-trigger is going to re-trigger the envelopes. And then we have legato, and we might not really hear a difference here. So here's the big difference. So let's go back to re-trigger, and let's add a filter here. So let's go VCF1, give us some good amount of resonance here, and then maybe have the cutoff here. And let's have an envelope. So let's go maybe envelope number 2, and then let's make this envelope kind of move that cutoff a little bit. So we're going to give a little bit of modulation here. And let's take the sustain down. Maybe a little less decay. Okay, so we have that bam, 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 whatever, you know, that type of sound, right? Okay, so if we're on re-trigger, it's going to re-trigger that envelope every single time. And that might be nice for maybe some kind of basses maybe, or a sequence or something kind of like that if you really want that sound to get re-triggered every time. But if you don't, we can always change this to legato, which is still mono. And if we play different notes at the same time, it's not going to re-trigger that envelope. It's only when we let go and then play it again. And if we play notes individually like that, it's going to kind of be like the re-trigger mode, but if we play them while we're holding them down, then it's not going to re-trigger. So hopefully that makes sense there. Moving on from there, we have the arpeggiator. So it's I think a lot of people get confused in the sense that we have an arp over here on the arp control, but we don't really know what we're looking at. We're like, how do we turn this thing on? So keep in mind that if you want to use an arp or a sequence or something like that, you're going to change this in the voice section to arpeggiator. So let's go to the arp control real quick. Let's remove the octave to 0, increase the sync here. So that's basically, we have an arp going on right here. And we're going to get into all the settings a little bit later, but I wanted to let you know that in the voice section, this is where you would activate the arpeggiator, because that's sometimes an easy thing to overlook. And last but not least, we have duophonic. So this one is also interesting. So let's go to a new preset again, and let's select duophonic. So this one is kind of strange because it's low note and high note priority. So it's kind of like the re-trigger modes, but in a different sense here. So let's say we're on oscillator 1, right? And we hit a note, and let's hit a higher note. Nothing happens. But if we hit a lower note, we can do a re-trigger kind of like that, right? Like a monophonic kind of thing. So it's only going to follow the low notes on the odd modules. However, if we change this to oscillator number 2 and disable number 1 and play the same note and go high, it will follow those notes. However, if we go low, it's not going to trigger anything else. So keep in mind that basically duophonic, if you're using even numbered modules, so oscillator 2, oscillator 4, things like that, then it's going to follow those notes when it's ascending pitch. But it will not do that on the low. And the opposite is true for oscillator number 1. So we disable number 2 by double clicking, enable number 1 by double clicking, and go high. Nothing triggers, and then if we go low, it triggers. So it's kind of interesting once you have both in here. So if we're having both, right, and we're holding down a note and we're ascending up in pitch, that really means that only oscillator 2 is going to be ascending in pitch while the first one is staying. So kind of an interesting concept to wrap your head around. So that basically does it for the voice section here. So let's go back to poly here and let's remove our second oscillator. So now we have voices, right? So how many voices are going to be retriggered? And this is an approximate value here. So by default, it's going to be a medium. So we have a choice of few, which is going to be 4 notes or 4 voices. And then medium is going to be 8 voices. And then 16 is going to be for many. So it really depends on how many voices you want to retrigger and how much CPU you really want to allocate to your patch here. So next up from here, let's go back to medium and then let's look at smooth attacks. So if you have really instantaneous attacks on your patches and you're kind of getting a little bit of clicks, make sure to keep this on. Or for example, maybe you want the clicks and you want the oscillators to reset every single time, which we're going to go into the oscillators in depth. But if you want them to reset and you want that consistent click, then make sure to turn that off. But if you want smooth attacks and you don't want the clicks, make sure to keep that on as well. Next up from here is voice drift. So this one's kind of cool because every time you hit a note, it's going to slightly detune it a little bit. And it's very hard to hear perceptively, but once you have a lot of notes going and chords and stuff like that, it really adds to the richness and it kind of emulates the analog vibe where the oscillators were never perfectly in tune as it is in digital. So I kind of tend to really like to keep this voice drift on. So yeah, that's what that one does here. Let's go back to an init preset, make sure we're all fresh again. And then we have micro tuning. So normally if we're in Western scales, Western music, stuff like that, we don't really need to change this. However, if you want to add different tuning for Zebra, you can totally do that by selecting none. And you have a couple different choices here that you can pick from, or you can download a .tune file from the internet and then put it in this folder. And you would right click the local and then go to open and explore and then drop it in that directory and then open it from there and make some cool, crazy sounds that maybe no one's heard of. So that'd be pretty cool. And then make sure to turn that on once you have that enabled. And moving on, last but not least, we have swing. So we're kind of all familiar with swing in arpeggiator, sequencer, right? It gives a little bit of a different rhythmic motion here, but this one's also a little bit interesting because it also affects synchronized LFOs, so keep that in mind as well. So yeah, these are the main global settings that we should all kind of be concerned with and know what they do because this is going to affect our patches globally, hence global. So yeah, thank you for watching. Hopefully you learned something. And in the next video, we're going to be diving into the oscillators, which is going to be probably a couple videos because these oscillators go very deep in as far as the different modes, right? We can go to the oscillator 1, we have geomorph, spectromorph. What the heck are these things? What do they do? What are these 1 through 16? So we're going to talk about all of this kind of stuff in the next couple of videos. So yeah, thanks for watching and we'll see you in the next one.